I mentioned I've been watching a lot of PBS recently. Wonderful documentary by Henry Louis Gates on the Black Christian Church. And one of the buildings that is featured is Mother Bethel AME here in Philadelphia, founded by Richard Allen. And the current pastor of that congregation is a friend and colleague of mine, the Reverend Dr. Mark Tyler. And Dr. Tyler was interviewed, that didn't make it into this documentary, but I found other places, in talking about his critique and analysis about the history of the Black church and the present Black church. And I found his analysis so fascinating and his critique so intriguing. To speak about the problems with the Black church today, the problems that the Black church is facing, center around the role of women, the role of LGBTQ folks, and the role of Black clergy in modern day justice and civil rights movements that often de-center explicitly religious folks and are often led by youth who don't identify as spiritual religious at all. In the PBS documentary by Dr. Gates, looking back at the history of the Black church, some of the problems they were facing revolve around the role of women, the role of LGBTQ folks, and the role of clergy who were centered in the justice movement, male clergy, and how they treated and were in relationship with those who were not male in clergy. One of the quotes from that documentary is that women and gay men were the backbone of the Black church. And yet those were folks who were often ostracized most. The role of women lifted up Jarena Lee, a woman who in 1819 felt the call to preach the gospel at Mother Bethel AME. And Richard Allen heard her say that and said, "That sounds great, but the rules don't allow it. There's no bylaw in the Book of Discipline that allows for a woman to preach." And this conflict between what the rules said and what was right caused friction. Another woman that was lifted up that I found so fascinating and almost intoxicating in how important it seems and how little I knew about her was a woman named Prathia Hall, who was from Philadelphia, like Jarena Lee, a Temple grad. She joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee after graduating from Temple. And in 1962, Prathia Hall went to Terrell County, Georgia. Terrible Terrell County, a seat of voter discrimination and racial violence. And at a service commemorating the burning down of a historically Black church, she was called to give a prayer to remember the Center of Civil Rights that had been a voter registration center. And she gave a prayer calling for peace and justice and racial reconciliations and reparations. And she kept repeating the phrase, "Lord, I have a dream. I have a dream." A young leader of the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King, was in attendance at that meeting. And she is said to have inspired his oratory at the March on Washington the next year. Prathia Hall would go on to graduate from Princeton Seminary, which is where I graduated from, to become a womanist theologian, to become the first woman in the Baptist Association of Ministers here in Philadelphia, to become a prophetic voice who dealt with loss and grief and was a staunch civil rights activist until her dying day. There's so many stories of the work of women behind the scenes and the work of folks on the margins who made the civil rights movement of the 1960s as successful as it was, and who are making today's civil rights movement a continued push for equality and justice for all. And as we look back on the history, we find that Prathia Parathea Hall's name is hard to find, but the March on Washington is everywhere you look. And we lift up the March on Washington, and we lift up the courage at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And we often find that there's overlooked people and stories behind it. The March on Washington, for as successful as it was, and with the brilliant oratory of Martin Luther King's take on Parathea Hall's dream, there were no women who spoke at that march. The story is that the women asked to speak, and the men said no. Mahalia Jackson, of course, sang, but the plan to lift up the role of women as the backbone of the Black Christian Church and the organizing backbone of events like the March on Washington, they were pushed aside, told to walk with their husbands in one instance, rather than be commemorated as separate individuals. These stories are hard to wrestle with, but it shows something that I did not always learn about, that the conflict inside of the civil rights movement, the disagreement over what was the best thing and the right thing to do, is something that we paper over in history. It's the conflict that we don't learn about, because that is a criticism that is hard to make of our heroes. We often learn about the conflict between, for example, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And I don't know how you learned it, but I learned it as Malcolm X was in the wrong and Dr. King was right. And that was the only conflict that mattered. But there was conflict and disagreement throughout the movement over nonviolent tactics, over which causes to lift up, over who should speak and who should not, over whether political points were more important than actual social action. That's hard to wrestle with. But the through line to today, as Dr. Tyler made clear, and Dr. Gates's documentary point out, is that there's disagreement in today's civil rights movement too. The conflict is ever present. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In today's movement, for example, the role of women and queer folks is less complicated than it was in the 1960s. But for many Black clergy, supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, can be a hard decision because of LGBT folks being centered, because of some of the socialist actions and philosophies that guide it. The conflict about the role of women and the role of queer folks goes back to the 1960s, to a time when one of our other unsung heroes made his name on the stage. Bayard Rustin was a gay man from Westchester, Pennsylvania. He is looked on as a hero, an icon for so many today. And as far as I know, he never publicly called himself gay until at least 1985, when he was nearly 70 years old. But he made no attempt to shy away from his sexuality. And it is that openness and confidence that endears him to so many, apart from his brilliant organizing mind and his absolute commitment to nonviolence, racial justice, and equality for all. Bayard Rustin was someone I didn't know a lot about, and I've so enjoyed learning about him. A man from just up the road in Westchester who lived in a segregated society, used his voice and his words to win over people, to sing into their hearts, and to convince their better angels of the rightness of both nonviolent direct action and racial justice. But as a gay man in the 1960s, he was considered untouchable by many. and his public persona demanded that he stay in the closet. He is the lead organizer of the March on Washington, one of the most successful political action moments in American history. But he was not listed on the official program and was only allowed to speak towards the end because of his sexuality, because of who he was, because of the conflicts between he and Dr. King over tactics, and the conflict between he and Dr. King's circle of advisors over his quote unquote morality. This is critique that's lifted up by Dr. Tyler and others. It's a critique of the Black church by the Black church. I don't feel that I can offer criticism that is helpful or useful. So I have a wondering. About the relationships between Bayard Rustin, between Prathia Hall, between Jarena Lee, and all the folks who are unnamed in the history of the civil rights movement, with those who are, with those who held the power and those whose voices were heard. I wonder if they used a covenantal model of relationship. And I wonder what it would have looked like if they had. If there was a covenantal relationship between, for example, Bayard Rustin and the folks who needed his voice and his skin color, but didn't need all of him, and refused to center him in ways that would have made his full humanity acceptable and part of the movement. That feels more like a contractual relationship, to use someone for their skills rather than who they are. And perhaps it was that contractual model that was the only one that made sense within the white supremacy culture of America in the 1960s. Maybe gaining political victories at any cost was simply what they had to do, even if that meant not fully respecting the women or the gay men of the movement. I don't know, but I wonder. And in that wondering, it makes me so grateful for today that because of their sacrifices and their work, we have an opportunity to continue the legacy and continue Prathia Hall's dream, and to be known as a Unitarian Universalist religion that thrives on covenant and not contract, that thrives on our differences and doesn't try to paper them over, that thrives on working to center marginalized voices rather than letting the same people speak over and over. It is our covenant that we come back to again and again and again that fills me with gratitude and inspiration and hope. And it is learning from our history and looking back at the disagreements and the rough relationships that were so present in the 1960s that I never learned about. But I often thought everyone was on the same side and everyone had the same goal and they were all working together to get there. But that's simply not true. There were disagreements and fights and conflicts. There was no uniformity back then or now. But it is that lack of uniformity in Unitarian Universalism that I find to be our greatest strength. In this past newsletter, I talked about how our vote has pushed us into conflict. And that's not entirely true. In fact, we have been in conflict, not just here in our little congregation, but Unitarian Universalism. In fact, I would say that we are always in conflict, because conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily an all-out fight and screaming and calling each other names. Conflict is what happens when people get together and disagree or have different ideas on tactics or strategies. You can be in conflict, as Bayard Rustin and Dr. King's advisors were, and still be committed to the same cause. A letter from Bayard Rustin says exactly this. It says, people often say that we disagreed and that we were at odds with one another, and we were, but over tactics. We both wanted the same goal. We both had the same dream. In Unitarian Universalism, we agree to abide by a covenant that says that we are committed to the same cause, the building of beloved community, justice, equity, and compassion in all human relations, the goal of a world community of justice and peace. But how we get there leads to disagreements, and it leads to conflict. And my friends, conflict is not a bad thing. But if you grew up like I did, you were taught that conflict is a dirty word. It's a negative thing. It can't lead to anything good. So when I look back on the history of Bayard Rustin, a man who was arrested 28 times for social justice causes, who decided that everywhere he went in the South, he would cause a scene. He would sit in the front of the bus. He would walk into stores he was not allowed to go to create conflict. Because how else, he said, would little white children in Terrell County, Georgia, know that injustice is wrong? Unless he used his body and his nonviolent action to do something about it. So I was taught to fear conflict and avoid it at all costs. But now I wonder, how else do we grow? And what else did Bayard Rustin use to reach and teach people other than to create conflict? To create constructive conflict that led to positive growth. And after he got done pushing people into spaces of discomfort to help them find growth, he would sing and use his beautiful voice to bring folks back together, to remind them to come back to the table and that we're committed to the same cause. I am inspired and in awe of Bayard Rustin, of his use of tactics, of his commitment to nonviolence, the use of his tools, all of them, and his ability to create conflict to help people grow. I was talking with KP about my theory that I think the only way we grow is through conflict. And I invite your feedback on that, because that's my theory, and I feel pretty strongly about it. So my friends, yes, we are in conflict. We have always been in conflict. When the conflict is more clear, we can resolve it more easily. But that only happens when we recognize that we are all committed to the same cause, that we're all part of the same covenantal community. And that doesn't mean that we all agree all the time. It means that because of our disagreements, we are made stronger. That's an inspiring lesson from the civil rights movement and from our own Unitarian Universalist history. So I'll end with one final story about conflict. At the 1968 General Assembly in Boston, following the assassination of Dr. King, there was a commitment asked for by Black Unitarian Universalists for money to be put towards Black liberation causes. And the UUA initially agreed. And then in 1968, they started to renege on their commitments. A walkout happened, and the denomination nearly split in half, much along racial lines. A deep divide had to be bridged. And it took the work of unsung heroes to bring the denomination back together, to invite many of the Black UUs back in with assurances of commitments of money and support. They gathered at a nearby church, the Arlington Street Church in Boston. And when the commitment was again agreed upon, they came back. And as they re-entered the space in Boston, they sang the song, "We Shall Overcome. We shall overcome someday." My friends, by being a part of this community, we agree to abide by our covenant. It means we are committed. We learn from the commitment of others. We learn from sharing with one another. And we learn from finding our own place by growing from our conflicts. There are lots of different ways to be a community. We can disagree and be in constructive conflict and change for the better. And as the examples of Bayard Rustin and Prathia Hall and Jarena Lee, those names that we didn't always learn about, that help us to become who we want to be. That's my commitment. I hope you'll join me in finding yours. I will end with a poem from Don S. Smith, a Black queer poet who wrote a poem for Bayard Rustin. And I invite you to find it online. It's very powerful. But I'll end with these last lines for Bayard. Today we owe our lives to you for your sacrifice, for your selflessness, you historyless man, forgotten prophet, savior dressed in shadows. You made us one. If we don't know your name, we shall learn it. May it be so.